Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Adong Judith's play, Silent Voices. So this is a play built out of interviews that Judith did with so I'll just read what it says here in the sort of preliminary material. A one-act play based on interviews with war crimes victims of the Northern Uganda War, 1986 to 2006. I'm not 100% clear from the introductory material in this collection, Contemporary Plays by African Women, or from what Judith says in her critical introduction, whether this is what we call a documentary theater piece, where the voices of the characters are specifically reflecting the actual words of people that Judith interviewed, or whether this is more of a sort of inspired by type scenario in which she did these interviews, and out of the general sort of stories, the shared experiences, etc., she built these characters and constructed the characters' experience, right? So it's not clear to me which of those is more accurate, but I think that for me, for the moment, the stakes are quite low because either of those represent a fundamental truth about the experiences that people had during these conflicts in northern Uganda. And it's an extremely brutal play in many, many ways. A lot of it revolves around the experiences of child soldiers, of girls, more so than adult women, but of girls being kidnapped into sex slavery, mass violence against civilians, mass sexual violence, the use of gang rape as a tool of war, etc., etc. These sort of really horrific things carried out by groups like Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army and others. And Kony himself does not show up in the play, but there seem to be characters that are somewhat based on Kony or that are based on other figures similar to Kony. We get sort of direct depictions of this type of violence, much of which actually happens off stage. But we get, for instance, child soldiers who are forced to execute other children. We get the torture of civilians, but we also have things reported, right? People give testimony in a trial scene toward the end, but it's not a trial of the perpetrators of this violence. It's a trial of a particular woman who has committed a set of crimes. But in the course of this trial, a number of people step up and they talk about their own experiences of violence, of suffering, of these sort of horrendous acts of degradation that they were subjected to. And this is and the central theme sort of becomes that in the interests of making peace, the powers that be imposed a peace without seeking justice for victims of crimes. And a big part of that comes down to an attempt to seek justice against the rebel groups or government soldiers who have committed these atrocities would extend the fighting. And so there is on some level a practical reason to forego seeking justice. But I mean, in contrast to something like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not having any sort of justice done creates this sort of gaping traumatic wound of unresolved anger, unresolved hatred, unresolved fear, etc., etc. And the lawyer for Mother, who's the woman who's on trial at the end, sort of sums this up. 20 years ago, we all jubilated because the peace agreement had been reached. Papers were signed, motto opus was danced. Everything seemed fine, in fact, great. Our leaders were all joy, proclaiming forgiveness on behalf of victims they never consulted. We all lacked the eyes to see that no amount of signatures on paper could make right the wrongs that had been done, and that no amount of signatures on paper could take away the pain, and that no amount of motto opus could wash away the bitterness. It's this blindness that makes the world blind. It's this blindness that makes the world dark. One thing, however, cures the world. Just one thing to give the victims closure. Justice. Such blindness breeds insanity. So I say, yes, insanity is as real as Badibakta Mental Hospital. And my client suffers such insanity. Insanity I know you will all prove beyond any doubt by the end of this court hearing. And so the argument essentially is that this is a situation in which these horrendous crimes were committed on mass scale, violence against civilians, violence against individuals, violence against communities, torture, mutilation, psychological, brainwashing of child soldiers, psychological torture, etc., etc., all of these things. And there was no resolution for the victims of these experiences, but those who had committed that violence often were sort of rewarded by being brought back within the systems of power within a peaceful Uganda, right? And this is one of the things that Mother brings up, because Mother and Omani, her son, so Mother was a child bride / slave wife to a rebel commander, and Omani was his son. And this conversation takes place after the peace. So after, but they have also experienced violence by government forces in retribution for their connection to this rebel leader. So Omani says at one point here, "It was a liberation, Mother. Certain sacrifices had to be made." Mother says, "So where's your liberation right now, son? Where's your liberation? Selling little things in a village shop while they cruise in luxuries?" Omani says, things always don't work out as planned. We can't blame the leaders for that." Mother says, "What leaders? You call those murderers leaders?" Omani says, "We will all be compensated." Mother says, "When?" Omani says, "Their compensation came first. They say ours is coming soon." Mother says, "Son, you call theirs compensation? No way, they've just been rewarded." Omani says, "You don't understand." Mother says, "What is there to understand? It is plain and clear." Omani says, "It's amnesty, Mother." Mother says, "Stop throwing around big words that you don't understand." Omani says, "It's forgiveness and compensation, Mother, the surest way to peace. Don't you want peace?" Mother says, and why start with them? Why start with the very perpetrators while their victims sprawl in poverty and more suffering? So much luxuries for so much destruction. They think they can get away with everything and we live happily thereafter. And so this is really the central thing that that Judith's play is primarily concerned with, is the ethos of constructing a post-conflict socioeconomic system in which warlords and the most brutal and violent people are placed into positions of power and privilege. And the silent voices of the title are the voices of the victims crying out for justice and not finding it forthcoming. So that's really sort of the central thing here. But on the level of the construction of the play, I think it actually is really, really interesting, because a number of the things that Judith does structurally here reflect this sort of experience of trauma, right? So this is a kind of a dream play. Mother has these psychological breaks where she seems to lose touch with reality, and the other actors sort of shift fluidly from the characters of the real world that Mother currently inhabits to the characters of her memories, or there's a character named Margaret who runs a rehabilitation center for child soldiers, and one of the things that they do is they sort of talk through and perform through their experiences as child soldiers and try to sort of come to terms with these things. And so there's a tremendous amount of slippage in the reality of that, right? We go from this is the rehabilitation center to this is the experiences of these child soldiers and back again. And so that reflects this sort of fragmented, traumatized, PTSD type experience of the world. And it's really, really well constructed in that sense, because it does give us, as viewers of the play, or readers of the play in my case, this sort of broken up experience that really helps depict the psychological trauma at the heart of the play. And the other thing that Judith does that I think is super, super cool is this is an extremely communal play. So in the preliminary information, sorry, there's a note on characters in the play, and it says here, the original production was staged with 30 performers as shown below because it was important for the playwright/producer to capture the communal essence of the Akoli people. However, recognizing financial challenges usually involved in productions, especially in a capitalistic world, producers and/or directors can choose to use the number of cast as per their discretion, as long as it does not interfere with meaning of the play as intended. So I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I find really admirable in theater productions is a large cast drawing on a communal ethos, but then you combine that with stage directions like the audience must always be addressed as part of the different groups, rebels, community, public attendance at a court hearing. And there's this sort of implication, or this sort of structure in which the walls, the fourth wall, traditionally, between the performers and the audience is broken down. right? As the play builds these depictions and utilizes these depictions of community, and as it undercuts the gap that we often experience between performers and audiences are implicated within this world, both in the negative sense, right, of we as a society engaged in this kind of violence, but also in the positive sense, we as a society are trying to heal from this. And I think it's really, really good. I think that's a really, really effective technique.